Welcome to the Society for American Soccer History's SASH session with Brian Bunk, author of From Football to Soccer, the Early History of the Beautiful Game in the United States. This is our first virtual session since last May. There was Zoom fatigue. So a hearty welcome back to many of you and a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can best find us in two places: on the web at ussoccerhistory.org or on social media. We have Facebook and Twitter accounts. If you'd like to join the Society, we encourage you to do so. It's a great value at $20 per year. Please hit that Join SASH tab on our website. Please indulge a few quick updates on some happenings since we last met. Zach Bigalke, our secretary, is now ABD, all but dissertation in Penn State's PhD program. His dissertation will examine foreign-born players in international soccer competitions. Our member, Chuck Carlson, who I believe is on the call, is in his first season as club historian for Chicago House AC, a new team in the National Independent Soccer Association. He's done some great work documenting Chicago's rich history on social media so far this season. And of course, we have two monumental new books out since we last met. One, which is our subject today, and the other, which will be the future of a future SASH session. Our treasurer, George Kiosis, co-edited Soccer Frontiers, the Global Game in the United States, 1863 to 1913. I'm proud to report that nearly all of the authors are members of our society. In the book's introduction, George's co-editor, Chris Bolzman, argues that American soccer history has long been neglected and has not always been taken seriously. Brian D. Bunk, who appears in that collection, has taken soccer history seriously. And notably, he has taken early soccer history seriously. Bunk is a senior lecturer in the history department at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and teaches courses in world history and the history of sport. He's author of The Ghosts of Passion, Martyrdom, Gender, and the Origins of the Spanish Civil War, numerous academic articles, and the book under discussion today. He has also created the Soccer History USA podcast, and as past treasurer of SASH, he has authored many articles for the Society website. Blurbs on the back of books are great, but I've got something better to share with you today, a text message from a Society member who read Brian's book recently. It reads, and I quote, "I told Brian after reading his book that I now know what it must have been like to be in a band in 1967, thinking that I'm recording great music. Then the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. From Football to Soccer is hands down the best formal academic distillation of early US soccer history that I've read," end quote. So in the soccer world, George Best has been referred to as the fifth Beatle. For our purposes today, Brian takes that mantle. So I'll pass it over to him now. He'll kick off the session with a brief slideshow, and then we'll open up the discussion for a question and answer period. Brian.
Yeah, Brian, you need to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks for everyone for coming and joining the call, and thanks to SASH for hosting this book talk, and thanks to Tom for that quote. I hope I can live up to that. I'm not sure, but we'll see, I guess. But yeah, like Tom said, I guess what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about kind of how I got to this project. It may be a little, I mean, many of you may have heard this or parts of this story before. And then I thought I'd just kind of go through the book and highlight, what the chapters are about and what I was thinking, and hopefully say a little something about people who influenced me or helped me, make it possible. So let me see, I'll start. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about how I got to this point. And like I said, it may be a little unusual, I think. I also wanted to put up this flyer here from the press so that if anyone hasn't yet purchased, I can't imagine why you all would not have already had a copy, a well thumbed over copy already. But if not, there's a 30% discount that you can get by going to the University of Illinois website and buying the book there. The code is S21UIP. And at the end of the talk, I'll put the flyer up again, just in case you want to buy the book again after the talk. So just a little bit about how I came to soccer as an academic subject, but also kind of as a fan, because I was never really a player. I never really played organized soccer probably until graduate school. And even though I grew up in Minnesota during the time of the Kicks and the NASL, and even lived for a time in Bloomington where they played their home games, I was only kind of vaguely aware of soccer as a major sport, or even as a professional sport. I was much more into hockey as a player, and of course as a fan. And I have to admit, I would probably still say that hockey is my favorite sport to watch to this day. But anyway, so that was kind of the way things were all throughout high school and even into college. And then I spent a semester studying abroad in the Republic of Ireland. And I was in Galway on the West Coast. And it was there that I attended probably my first soccer game that I can remember. I may have seen someone, at some other point, but for some reason, and I can't remember much about it, but we went to see the local team, Galway United. Again, I don't remember much about the game itself. It was wet and muddy and raining, which was pretty much par for the course in Galway. This was in the spring of 1990. And but I did remember the excitement and just how enthusiastic the crowd was, and the singing and that sort of thing. So it was really kind of a great experience, and I guess a first, if limited, introduction to European soccer. And since I was in Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland, in 1990, that year they of course went to the World Cup, and the whole country was just incredibly excited about it. And there were all these songs and merchandise, and I was on the radio all the time and all this kind of stuff. And I was already a fan of the Pogues, the band, the Irish band, the Pogues. And they put out a song which I thought was great. I still think is a great song. And again, that sort of just gave me an insight into the experience of what soccer meant to a country and to people. And then that summer, of course, was the World Cup in Italy. And I remember watching that opening match, Argentina against Cameroon, in the hotel room in London, and by myself. And it was probably still is, the greatest soccer match I've ever seen. It was just so exciting, and again, just the whole pageantry of it all, and that really kind of made me an aficionado, maybe for the first time. Oops, why is this not? But then I finished my studies, and I became interested in the history of Spain, and I went on to graduate school to study Spanish history. And that meant that I spent a great deal of time in Spain in particular. And again, I was exposed to Spanish soccer, and was able to watch it on TV. And I don't think I went to any matches while I was there at that point. Later, I got to go see Barcelona, in the Camp Nou, which was a really great experience as well. But I still wasn't really interested in it as an academic subject. And so I went on, did my dissertation, wrote my dissertation. I had a group of friends who were into, many who studied European history or were European. and then a bunch of Americans who were interested in soccer. And so throughout the 90s, we had to try to find ways to watch important matches, like, begging bars to put the Champions League games on the satellite TV. Or I remember for the Euros in 1996, we bought a mini satellite dish, and then we bought we pooled our money to buy a package so we could watch all the games. And at the end, because we were poor graduate students, we returned the satellite dish at the end of the tournament. So I was a fan more than I was interested in academically, I would say, at that point into the 90s. And then I finished my book there, which I don't have a discount code. If you're interested, it's still available at all major outlets. And I was looking around for something else, a next research topic. And I became interested in the Spanish immigrant community in New York City in particular. And through the course of doing research on that community, which hadn't really been well studied at that point, it's still probably not well studied at this point, I found out that they had their own soccer league. They had a Spanish American soccer league in the 1920s, including a team called FC Barcelona, which I don't think had any connection to the original club. And so that kind of led me down the path of being interested in, what was going on in the rest of the United States in terms of soccer. And then that led me to the bits and pieces of work that had been done at that point. It wasn't a very well-studied topic, but there were, of course, major contributions: Roger Alloway, Colin Jones, David Litterer, Melvin Smith. I read the articles that came across Dave's American Soccer History Archives and Steve Holroyd's work, and I just became really interested then in this topic, which, as Tom quoted Chris at the beginning, it really hadn't been very well studied. I see Stephen Apostoloff is on the call. I saw his work, Gabe's dissertation eventually. So I slowly realized that there was a community of people working on this, but it was a topic that still hadn't been really well covered. And so I decided to kind of just examine whatever interested me, whatever topics I came across. And I wanted to try to come up with a way of communicating that research in a more accessible way. I think there were a lot of people who were interested in this kind of research and maybe not necessarily interested in academic articles in academic journals that are behind paywalls. And so I came up with the podcast idea, which launched in 2013, I think it was. And I just explored topics that interested me. Whatever I kind of caught my eye, I would do some research and produce a show and a post, and that's how it went. But after a while, I realized that there were limitations to that, and that I think it was important that there be something that was maybe less ephemeral. Podcasts can come and go, even writing for websites. You just never know when something is going to disappear. And so that made me think I should probably try to write something longer and more coherent than my podcast subjects had been up to that point. And so that's how I guess I came across the book. Is I was becoming more and more interested really in the early period, which again was something that was of interest in England. The origins debate and all sorts of literature produced about when football began and the evolution of the rules and things like that. And I was intrigued by that and thought, well, what's the story in the United States? Is something similar happening? And so I think that's what led me to focus on the maybe the earlier period, the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So that's sort of how I got to where, the book, I guess that's a long journey, but that kind of explains it. So, just like quick summaries, I guess, of the chapters or the different sections of the book. And I'll just kind of hit some of the highlights and also show some images. Most of these are not in the book. These are bonus images, I guess, that are related either for one reason or another I couldn't put in the book, or I didn't even know about in some cases before the book was published. So the first 3 chapters are what I would call maybe the prehistory of soccer in the United States, because these are not soccer games. They're not, I don't try to make an argument that there's some direct link between these early forms of the sport and later organized soccer in the United States. But I think it is important that we recognize that there was this history of soccer-like games, football games that were being played in the United States for centuries before the codification of what we know as association football in the second half of the 19th century. And so I wanted to kind of connect those 2 things, soccer and the sort of pre-soccer games, because I think at the time, the people didn't really think about it in those terms. They just played football, and then it gradually evolved over time. And so I wanted to try to at least represent that in the book, and not try to make hard, fast distinctions between, based on rules, I guess. And I was influenced by, particularly by Tony Collins in England, and his sort of writing and speaking about this particular topic. I think he called these early sort of games the primordial stew out of which soccer and rugby and American football and Australian rules football and all the other variations came about. And so I like that. So I guess that these first 3 chapters are sort of the primordial ooze of, North American football. So chapter 1 is really about indigenous football in North America. And I try to collect different accounts from around the country, around the United States, and even into Canada. Not so much, again, to argue that there's some kind of direct link to be made between these games and later games, but rather to, just like I say, collect these accounts and try to explain the role that these games played in indigenous cultures across the country. And across the continent, I guess, maybe better said, North Canada and the United States. The schoolboys game is about how football really emerged as a game for young boys in particular, and the impact that would have on later attitudes towards the sport. As baseball kind of moved beyond this notion as a childhood game, football really never gets past that, maybe until the end of the 19th century. And so I think in some ways, this attitude that soccer is a game for kids is kind of an old notion that dates back quite a long time. And then the last one, Manly Games of Celebration and Escape, is really about the occasions when men did play football. And these were kind of special occasions where maybe the usual rules and the usual strictures on men's behavior were kind of loosened. So I talk about different categories like nostalgia football, where men played as a kind of memory of their own school days. Holiday football, like on Thanksgiving or Christmas, or picnics. Benevolent societies and ethnic clubs would have these picnics, and they would often include football games. Military games played in camps. And then club football. And this was another area where I was influenced by the literature in English football history, where there's the debate about small-sided games and the role that they played ultimately in the evolution of association football. And I found that those sorts of games were almost non-existent, really, and that clubs don't really begin to form until much later. And I should also mention the International Football History Conference. A lot of this research was originally presented in one form or another at the International Football History Conference put on by Gary James I guess it's been in Manchester every time. It was supposed to be in Scotland in 2020, and hopefully it'll be revived. But I mean, everyone I met at those conferences was really great, and it was a really warm and welcoming community of scholars and people who were really interested in the history of football. And for someone who is a relative novice at the sport and at the study of the sport, it was really really great to have that opportunity. So these photographs here, this one up here on the, I guess on the right, I don't know if it's maybe on your left, but this one here is of, it's a little bit later. I think it's from the 1920s from the Archives Canada, and it shows Inuit game. It could be a stick and ball game, or it could be a kind of a kicking game. But this is an image that's not in the book. This is from 1808, a child rearing manual. They often described football as an appropriate game for young men to kind of, grow and, become proper adult men. This is a good illustration about the challenge sometimes of trying to figure out the exact rules. It looks like, obviously, this guy is kicking the ball. It kind of looks like the other guy is maybe about to catch it, but who knows? And this picture does appear in the book. It's from the Civil War. Probably about 1865, I want to say. And it shows probably one of the earliest football photographs in the world. I think there is a photograph from the 1850s that purports to show rugby football, but there's not very many anyway that are much older. And it's not a very exciting photograph. Due to the limitations at the time, everybody had to stay as still as possible. So it's, but you can kind of see this guy's about to kick the ball that is being held by this guy here. Initially, I thought that this other guy on the far right was preparing maybe to catch it or something. But when I look closely, you can't really see it, but he's actually holding a dog, but the dog has been moving, so it sort of disappeared on the final photograph. So, so the next two chapters are soccer chapters, I guess we could say. And the first one is called Steel City Soccer, which is about Pittsburgh. And a couple of things that I wanted to do with the book was to try to make it accessible to non-academics, to balance out, making it obviously a well-researched and a well-researched contribution to the broader historiography on the history of soccer and the history of sport. But I also wanted to try to make it accessible to people who are not necessarily interested in academic histories. And so I wanted to try to include some, concrete stories, or some almost humanize the stories so that people could identify with it and maybe gain something out of it in that way. And so I wanted to try to use case studies either of particular places or particular individuals that could illustrate some of the broader themes and topics that I discuss in the chapters. And so the Steel City Soccer chapter uses Pittsburgh, which was an area that hadn't really been well covered or well documented, to illustrate some of these broader points about the way that soccer emerged in the 1880s and 1890s, and even then after the turn of the 20th century. And so a lot of the ideas and themes that I think are common in soccer playing areas around the country appear in Pittsburgh. And so that includes things like the importance of British immigrants, particularly Scots, in the organization of these clubs and these teams and these competitions. The importance of family members. I often ran across in Pittsburgh multiple family members who played on the same team. Again, most of them were either originally from Scotland or from England. The role that skilled industrial workers played and how they used soccer as a means to kind of distinguish themselves from other lesser paid working class industrial laborers. Let's see, what else? The sort of rise and fall of the sport in different areas. So in Pittsburgh, there's a huge rise at the end of the 1880s and into the 1890s, and then it almost disappears completely around the turn of the 20th century, and then is revived and thrives up to World War I and even afterwards. So that's another sort of common theme that we see. The dating might be a little bit different depending on where you go, but that theme is pretty consistent across the country. Also, the conflicts. I know I've had conversations with people, and everyone knows that the history of soccer in the US is often one of contention. And that was true in Pittsburgh. Players fighting with each other on the pitch, teams complaining and disputing calls by referees, complaining about the pitch, teams not showing up, all those things appear in Pittsburgh as well. So also gambling, which is something that is sometimes hard to get at in the sources. But again, Pittsburgh as a kind of case study for these broader themes. Chapter 5, Soccer Goes Pro, talks about the pro leagues in 1894. Probably a critical moment. I mean, we don't want to practice in what ifs, but if those leagues, either one of them, had succeeded, then maybe the history of the sport would be very different. And I thought it was worth exploring in detail why, especially the baseball team owners decided to launch a pro league, and then and why a rival appeared at the same time, and then ultimately what happened and why they collapsed. So these photos, none of these are in the book. This one is of a team called Black Diamond FC, which I originally thought was from Washington State, but now I think it's was originally founded in Monongahela City, and then later became the Monongahela City Football Club. So this is from around 1904, 1905, something like that, maybe a little later. And then this photograph in the center was of, the photographer was from McDonald, Pennsylvania, which is again near to Pittsburgh. And McDonald was one of the leading teams in the earliest days of organized competition in Pittsburgh. And I'm not, again, sure when. This is probably later in the 1910s. And I'm not sure what team it is, presumably one from McDonald, but again, another Pittsburgh squad displaying their trophies and their hall of medals there. And then this one is of baseball player Charlie Abbey. There's another book of another picture of him in the book, and I just included it because he's kind of an absolute unit, and we don't have a lot of photographs, or any photographs really, of the professional leagues in 1894. I also thought I'd include this URL. You can go to my website, soccerhistoryusa.org, and go under the resources tabs. And I put together a database of all, or as many of the players as I could identify in the two professional leagues. So there's information there about names and birth dates and birthplaces, and any other information that I had about them at the time, and I've been trying to continually update it. So if folks have any additional information, I'm happy to add that to the database. And I couldn't have done that without the help of people like Ed Farnsworth and Steve Holroyd, Gary James, and other folks who helped to contribute information about these different players. Chapters 6 and 7 are about women's soccer. And I think, again, I wanted to, I guess, record the fact that women had been playing the sport in the United States for almost as long as men have. Indigenous women in some areas played variations of kicking games. And then there are records throughout the 19th century of women playing soccer in the United States. And so again, I wanted to include this in the book as a way of demonstrating that this notion of women's soccer as a kind of a new thing is not necessarily accurate. And so chapter 6 is describes some of the earliest mentions that we have of women playing football, or playing football at that point before the codification of soccer. And then I also spend most of the chapter talking about the first, or the earliest documented Women's Association football game in December 1893 in San Francisco, and try to, again, humanize the story a little bit by talking about the players as much as I can, and to sort of highlight their agency in choosing to play these sorts of games. And then chapter 7 is about women in soccer in the early 20th century. There's much of the chapter talks about how, as women began attending college in larger numbers at the end of the 19th century, soccer became or was encouraged as a sport that was appropriate for women, as opposed to football, intercollegiate or American football. And I think, again, this is important because later soccer would sometimes be opponents of the game would criticize it and say it was, as a women's game or a game for girls or something like that. And so I think in part, maybe that sort of stereotype emerges during this period when it was being promoted as a kind of a feminized alternative to intercollegiate football. And the chapter really focuses on two women, again, to sort of try to add a kind of personal or a human face to some of the history. Helen Clark and Doris Clark. Helen Clark from Bridgeport, Connecticut. That's her in the center there. That photo does appear in the book. And she, as far as I know, wasn't really ever a player, but was an administrator and a referee. And again, I think one of the contributions, or at least a small contribution of this chapter, is to show, again, that women were not just players, but also administrators and referees and coaches, even at a quite early period in the history of the sport. I also think that probably in the broader historiography, we don't spend enough time on administrators and referees and devote most of our attention to teams and players, which would make sense. But so I think that's another way in which this, or another small contribution I hope this chapter could make. And then on the other side here is a photograph which I couldn't include in the book for various reasons, but I believe that is a photograph of Doris Clark from her days as an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley. So I was happy to find the photograph. It was unfortunate that I couldn't use it in the book. And then on the right is a cartoon from the 1893 match from the San Francisco Chronicle. And then the last two chapters, the first, or the chapter 8, Soccer Goes to War, talks about the impact of the First World War on the sport in the United States. This was an important transitional period. There had been growing momentum through the 19-teens, and then the experience of war and the number of soldiers who had the opportunity to play soccer, either in military camps in the United States, many in areas that did not have as strong a soccer playing history as other areas. So some areas of the South, for instance, although maybe Patrick Sullivan would argue that point. But so men had the opportunity to play this game that, or watch the game that maybe they hadn't ever seen before. And then perhaps a bit like myself, going to Europe and seeing the popularity of the sport and playing the sport and watching the sport also, I think, contributed a great deal to the growth of the game in this country. And then ethnic soccer, or in this country in the 1920s, which Colin Joes called the golden years of American soccer. The last chapter explores Western Massachusetts as again, as a case study for the history of the sport. And Western Massachusetts in some ways touches on a lot of the themes of the book. There were Native American tribes who lived in the area. I don't know whether they played football, but they were at least linguistically connected to footballing playing groups in the eastern part of Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So it's entirely possible that they did play. The area is home to Smith College and Mount Holyoke College, where soccer was a popular pastime on campus in the early part of the 20th century. Soccer began to be played in the late 19th century in the area. And again, it was Scots and English immigrants who were the prime movers of those clubs and competitions. And so I wanted to talk about Western Mass as a case study about the limitations of relying on British immigrants primarily for soccer clubs, at least in some areas. So in Holyoke, Massachusetts, which was home to the Falcons in the inaugural season of the American Soccer League, it really never became very much a popular sport outside of those particular groups. So among Irish and French Canadian immigrants and even German immigrants, it had a limited reach. And I think that was also true in a number of other areas around the country. And then I also wanted to explore the role that industrial firms played in sponsoring soccer clubs and how it can be really difficult to figure out exactly how that assistance was implemented. We know that clubs like Far Alpaca, which was a textile manufacturer in Holyoke, supported their teams, but finding out exactly how and how much was often a difficult task. So these two photographs, again, are not in the book. This one on the right is of a match called the Chalou Cup, which was sort of like the city championship of Holyoke for a time there around 1910. This is the Holyoke Public Library. It looks like a few thousand people maybe. So the Chalou Cup was always very popular in the city. And then this one on the left is of the Inter-Allied Games, which was a competition organized by the YMCA and the US military, which was an Olympic style competition. The IOC forbid them from using the word Olympics, but it had a bunch of different athletic events, including a soccer tournament that had 8 teams, I think it was. It was ultimately won by Czechoslovakia, but it included teams from the US and Canada. And so this is a photograph of one of the match between the United States and Canada. Another photograph from this series appears in the book. And I think I saw Christian on the call. He was the one who actually found these photographs. So I appreciate that he alerted me to their presence at the Archives Canada. I also, I put this YouTube address, which is a little hard to find, but a few years ago, I found the National Archives held a number of films of just small, short film of Americans playing soccer overseas in Germany and in France in 1918 and 1919. And so I put together a compilation of those brief little snippets of film and posted them on YouTube. So that's the address. You can also search, I think it's on Tom McCabe's channel and not on the SASH channel for some reason. But if you search Tom McCabe Expeditionary Force, I think it comes up right away. Don't just search Tom McCabe, otherwise you come up with like a memorial service, which is a bit disturbing. But anyway, so yeah, you can either take a screenshot of that web address or just search if you want to watch some footage. I had the privilege of presenting this footage and a brief talk about this chapter at the SASH conference in 2018. And again, I just want to express my appreciation to all the folks at SASH. It's been a real pleasure to work with everyone, and it's been great to have this community of like-minded people who are interested in this, in the history of soccer in the United States. It's a small group, but growing, hopefully. And like I said, I couldn't have really written this book or completed this project without their help and support. Let's see. And so that's just a kind of quick run through. Here's the flyer again with a bigger image of the promo code to get 30% off of the book. So hopefully if you were intrigued by what you heard and don't have the book, you can pick it up at a discount. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.
That's wonderful, Brian. Thanks so much for joining us and walking us through, the process and then the chapters. So I'd love to just open up for any comments, questions. You can use, the raise hand. I see Gabe Logan with the hand right there. So we'll go to him next, and then Jed O'Brien as well. So Gabe, first question.
Thanks, Tom. Brian, wonderful work. I really enjoyed the read. Excellent research as well. I was especially intrigued with your chapter on early Native America and the indigenous games and your sampling of the indigenous nations. I was wondering if you had samples beyond those that you used in the monograph, or if you just limited that. Did you find any beyond those nations that you wrote about? Thanks.
I mean, I tried to write about as many as I could find. football or those sorts of football style games were not nearly as popular or as prevalent as lacrosse style games. And so I tried to write about as many as I could, and there may be some that just are so little information about, or or just I couldn't figure out a way to cram it all in. I guess I tried to include a discussion of almost everything I found, but I did tend to focus it on those areas where there was much more descriptive information, so that I could try to reconstruct at least a little bit of what it might have been like, for the players.
Jed, you're up next.
Thank you, Tom. Brian, fantastic talk, loved it. From a position of ignorance over here in Scotland, I just want to see if I've got it right. I get the feeling that because of the size of the country, particularly the eastern seaboard, is it fair for me to understand that you have a great number of industrial towns and cities, each independently having football development in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, but because of distance, they're not necessarily linked to one another. In a sense, there's whole separate areas of development which are all running in parallel to one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the case. Although I think we're finding out that they were a lot more connected than maybe we had previously thought. I know Ed Farnsworth has been working on a project chronicling intercity matches and connections between these different areas. And so there was a surprising amount of traveling and of communication between different cities. So even if Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia were all, kind of their own separate soccer communities that evolved and emerged at different times and in different ways, sometimes they still often communicated with each other and sometimes traveled fairly long distances to compete against each other. So yeah, I think basically you're right that there are almost like these independent centers that pop up, but they did have maybe a lot more awareness of each other than we might have previously assumed. And I think that another way is that they were connected sometimes through especially Scottish societies. So I was doing some research recently on the soccer community in Denver, and there was a guy who was originally from Scotland who was closely associated with the game and with organizing clubs and competitions. And one of the things that I found in his will was he had a subscription to the Scottish American, which was a newspaper published out of New York City. So I think there were different ways in which these communities were connected, whether directly through soccer or through these other mechanisms. So I think they were mostly independent, but they did have some communication between them.
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this point. I'm going to ask my question, and then we'll go to Peter Wilt's question. So Brian, we're in the midst of kind of history wars, current day in the United States. And you've talked about early in the book, kind of everything being football, right? We have these three codes, right? We have association football, we have, rugby, and then we have what becomes collegiate, American football. How did you weigh in on that debate? How troubling was that debate? What would you say, about, these different camps that are still kind of contesting the origins of ball games in the United States?
Yeah, to be honest, I kind of tried to stay out of it as much as I could. Again, I think a lot of my thinking originally was influenced by the literature on the origins debate in England. And as many of you have probably read, a lot of that material can get quite personal and pointed, and I don't know, maybe that's just a difference in academic culture, but I also thought in some ways, you know, I felt like I wanted to put this book out as a kind of, you know, early marker or something, and just to get the information out there. And then I think subsequent work can maybe focus in on those kinds of questions if researchers are interested in them. I just, to be honest, wasn't really that interested in that kind of particular question. I didn't have a dog in that fight necessarily. And, you know, there's so little information often about these games and the rules that were employed, is that it often becomes a question of a lot of speculation and trying to parse out the meaning of, you know, what is it when a source says carry it over the line? Does that mean literally they carried the ball over the line, or does it mean that the team sort of carried the ball, you know, or propelled the ball over the line or something like that? And I just thought that, you know, those sorts of minutia was going to make the book a lot more dull, and ultimately I thought it was really difficult to and maybe fruitless to try, like I said, to parse out the very limited information that we often have about the nature of these games and the rules that were involved.
Thank you. Over to Peter Wilt in Chicago.
Thanks. Great presentation, Brian. I guess my question or comment is a little bit along the lines of that with Tom's. The 1866 match between Carroll College boys and the town boys of Waukesha is referenced as the earliest match under the London rules of association football. Do you put any stock in that? Is it an outlier, especially considering where it was so far from the East Coast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I talk about that in the introduction. I spent quite a bit of time researching that particular game. It turns out, I mean, I have family in Wisconsin that live very close to Waukesha, so I was able to go, you know, to the archives at Carroll College, now Carroll University. And I guess my position on that is that it's possible that they used the association rules, but I think it's more likely that they used a version of the game that was played at Princeton during the 19th century, because the president of Carroll College at the time was a Princeton graduate, and he had been involved in athletics. I didn't find any proof that he had actually played football while he was at Princeton, but his brother was on the baseball team, and I think he played baseball as well. So I think it's probably more likely that it was either a traditional kind of football rules, or maybe the rules that he brought with him from Princeton, and not necessarily the association rules. It's entirely possible that they used the association rules. I just didn't find any evidence that could confirm that. And like I said, I think it's probably more likely that it was a Princeton style game. But again, more evidence, you know, could change. I think that's the other point I suppose I should stress, is that, you know, as everyone who's done research on US soccer knows, a lot of our information comes from newspapers. And as more and more newspapers are digitized, that's going to change our understanding. And so I fully expect that subsequent researchers will find information that might contradict or prove, you know, my conclusions to be wrong. But, you know, I tried to do the best I could with what information was available. And like I said, I don't have any evidence, you know, as much as a Wisconsin person, I would like that to be the case. I couldn't find anything to confirm it. So
yeah, that's an interesting theory. I hadn't heard that before. The other theory is that since it was a year after the Civil War, it may have been a Civil War veteran that brought a copy of the rules back from out east, mm-hmm. and may have used that as a guide.
Yeah, I mean, the headmaster or whatever, you know, he was from Princeton, he was from New Jersey, and he had I think worked as a high school principal for a while in that area. So it's entirely possible that he might have picked up a copy, the Beetle dime guide that was published in New York City in 1866, and he brought it with him. But like I said, I think later accounts, I think it was in 1906 or 1910, some of the students who were around at that point, not necessarily those who played played in those matches, talked about it, and they seemed to make a clear distinction between what they were playing and the sort of contemporary versions of the sport. Now, whether that's just intercollegiate football, which by that point was hugely popular, or whether they also meant soccer, I don't know.
Coincidentally, also at Carroll College in the early 1900s was the first forward pass in American football.
Interesting. One thing I didn't include in the book, because I don't, it's hard to prove necessarily, but I found in the Carroll College archives I don't know what you'd call it, a student publication, or it was like a handwritten sort of newspaper report, or like I said, I struggled with the editor about a copy editor about how to classify this in the bibliography, but it was basically handwritten notes about kind of what was happening at the college. And there was a note about the football games at that period. And from what I could establish, the editors of this publication or whatever were female students. And so I was toying with the idea of including it in the book as an early example of women as sports journalists, but I thought that was maybe a bit of a stretch, so I didn't include it. But
thank you.
Ed Farnsworth has a question, but he can't speak up at work, so he left it in the chat room. But it's a declension question. He says, Brian, what are your thoughts on the decline of soccer development in many areas in the mid to late 1890s, particularly on the East Coast, after the game had been established in the 1880s and early 1890s? So it's that, kind of age-old question. What's happening in the mid 1890s from your perspective?
I think it's probably the root cause was economic issues. I mean, there is a
Did we lose Brian there?
I don't know what happened. It suddenly dropped me out, I guess.
Okay, you're back in. We can hear you. So why don't you start again?
Yeah, I think primarily it had to do with economic problems in the country. There was a recession in 1893, I believe. And then I think the repercussions of that sort of made their way across the country. There was also labor strife in a lot of different areas. And in part, as a result of the economic issues in the country, immigration from the British Isles also slowed during that period. So you can kind of see that the high point of British immigration is in the 1880s and 1890s, and then it sort of starts to fall away. And I think those two things are definitely related. Because one thing I had to constantly keep in mind was that I was thinking, as I was researching the 1890s in particular, I kept thinking, well, why aren't other European immigrants playing the game? Why aren't they interested in supporting these things? Why is it just the Scots and the English, and some American born? And then I had to remind myself that, of course, it wasn't even that popular of a sport and hadn't even really reached a lot of European countries in the 1890s. And it's really only after the turn of the 20th century that you start to get, huge crowds in places like Spain and elsewhere. So, I mean, there was obviously soccer being played in Norway and the Netherlands and stuff in the 1890s, but it wasn't nearly as big of a sport as it is today. So I had to kind of constantly remind myself of that fact. I just wanted to point out, I meant to mention him in my intro, is Jack Huckle, who's I see is on the call. And he was another person, as I was just starting out being interested in this, when he was at the Soccer Hall of Fame. He was really generous with his time and very helpful. And again, I don't think I would have been able to complete the project if it wasn't for his help and support through all these years. So I just wanted to shout out Jack and his help. So
we've got another question via the chat from Patrick Sullivan, our resident Southern soccer expert, doing great work in Atlanta and Birmingham, Alabama. He's asking about the role of sport and the military, right? You've done some great work with the Army and the YMCA's role during World War I, even pushing it further back into the American Civil War. Are you aware, Patrick asks, of any other earlier examples in U.S. military history?
I didn't find anything about the U.S. military kind of actively supporting it in the ways that you mentioned in terms of buying footballs or providing footballs for the troops, as they did during the Civil War, and then really in a much more direct and active way in World War I. I did find some references to ball games being played during the Revolutionary War and a few mentions of football in particular, but it's hard to tell whether some of those mentions, when they say ball game or ball play, whether they're talking about forms of baseball or cricket or something, or whether it's football. And then when they do talk about actual football, it's doesn't seem like it's something that was promoted in a top-down way and was just something probably that the soldiers or the young men took up because it was a pastime that they had enjoyed, as children or as young men anyway. So I didn't find anything apart from the Civil War and World War I.
I'm gonna ask a quick hit as we wait for maybe someone else to raise their hand or write a question. I have, the peer review that was sent to the press, and I described you as an archive hound. What was your best, find or unbelievable find along the way that you stumbled on or you were looking for and found? Because I think we all have these moments.
I think finding that photograph from the Civil War was a pretty exciting moment, because like I said, I've tried to investigate a little bit further, but as I say, I think it's one of the oldest football photographs probably in the world. And I think, uncovering the story of the earliest women's game was also a pretty exciting moment, I think, as well. So I guess those would probably be the two biggest finds, I suppose. I'm trying to think of other ones. I mean, I think everybody, or most people who've done research into this can attest that anytime you find something that you're looking for or some piece of information is a pretty exciting moment. I mentioned Christian before, and he and I had done a bunch of work on the Canadian Inter-Allied Games team, and I mean, it doesn't appear in the book, obviously, and it's on the SASH website and on my website. And it was just a great feeling when trolling through all these Canadian military records from the First World War, and to actually find and identify who these men were was a pretty exciting moment. And we would exchange direct messages on Twitter about exciting finds that we had discovered in the newspaper or in the personnel records. So I think, finding this sort of really important stuff like the Civil War photograph is great, but also just finding those small things where you can actually confirm, who these players on this Canadian team were, was also, I think pretty important and satisfying.
We have a question from Ireland. Michael is unmuted himself.
Hello, thank you, Chair, and hello from Dublin, Brian. I was struck by your engagement with the football community in Galway when you were a study abroad student. And my question is actually about community. And one of the things in your storytelling today, and the book hasn't arrived just yet, but I've been struck in reading the story of American soccer about the role of communities, and whether they're ethnic or work-based or whatever, whether they're Spanish or Irish or Scottish or English. And it seems key in the development of soccer, which resonates now in America, about the role of fandom and spectatorship and the community supporting a football team. How much in your work that I will read, and I note the case study about Pittsburgh in particular, have community of people coming together for a common purpose, which ends up being playing football. How much of that did you find in your current research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key part of it, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to use both Pittsburgh and Western Massachusetts, and Holyoke as examples. Is I think that was precisely the role that these clubs and competitions played for these communities, especially, as I mentioned, the Scots and the English communities, that it was really a way of establishing that sense of community and kind of reaffirming their identities as Scots and English immigrants. They're in this new place and this different community, and I think it was a way for them to sort of connect in some way with their homelands, and as a way of distinguishing themselves from other communities within these industrial cities. So a lot of the British immigrants tended to be more skilled industrial laborers. And so again, the clubs and the competitions were a way of marking themselves off from lower paid, often other, immigrant industrial workers of other immigrant groups. So I think that was probably one of the motivating factors, was an effort to maintain this sense of British identity and British community. I mean, Pittsburgh in particular, there were German immigrants and there were immigrants from other areas, but they were mostly distinct communities, and the soccer playing was really something that the British and native-born American people did, and not really other communities or other ethnic groups within the community or even within the same factory.
Any other hands raised, or anybody want to chime in with a question? We have somebody who could go right now if no one raises their hand. We're just
Looks like
past
Peter
the hour
has-
mark.
Looks like Peter has his hand up, although the hand on your little icon makes it look like it's that Italian player's hand, and just, it's giant.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it's like that
It looks like
must
an
be,
oversized Bonucci or Chiellini.
yeah, or like Insignia is small but has a big hand or something like that. Peter.
All right.
And if people don't know, Peter Alleghi is a great friend of the society. This kind of programming has been modeled after the Football Scholars Forum, which he started many years ago. So a true inspiration friend for us here at SASH.
Well, thanks, Tom, for the kind words. Great to be the interloper here in the group. And I've enjoyed reading Brian's work. And just as an outsider, not an expert on US soccer, I really learned a lot about ethnicity and class from reading this book. And I'm wondering whether you can reflect a little bit on the role of the early game in the country in helping to craft racial identities, and particularly a kind of new whiteness that seems to be emerging in these particularly northeastern urban industrial centers with these recent immigrants, especially from Northern and Eastern Europe, vis-a-vis some of the communities of color in this country and other previous immigrants from other world regions? Or is the construction of whiteness and its relationship to football something that happens after World War II mainly? Thank you.
I mean, that's a great question. I guess I would have to think about it. Maybe that's not a satisfactory answer. I'm not sure. I mean, I think generally the sport was popular in some communities, but never, I'm not sure that it had as much cultural or social clout that it would be a major contributing factor in the way that other pastimes, baseball, for instance, might have been. As I mentioned earlier, our reliance on newspapers means that we don't have a lot of information about when or if or whether people of color played football. So I think that's an area of research. I mean, Ed Farnsworth and I have worked on some research about a couple of brothers, African-American brothers, who played the game in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in the 1890s and into the 20th century. And so it's really a difficult question in the way, just because I'm not sure that it had enough clout to play a significant role in the construction of whiteness during this period. But I mean, it would be interesting to look at it, whether or not soccer was clearly a way for British immigrants to distinguish themselves from other European immigrants, especially Irish, well, to a lesser extent Irish, but Southern European immigrants. And so, yeah, was there a part of that involved, kind of racial terms, is a difficult thing. I mean, I have written a little bit about sport and race in the 1920s in New York City, more specifically about boxing. And boxing, and to a lesser extent soccer, were definitely used by some Spaniards anyway, to kind of draw racial lines between them and the growing Puerto Rican community in New York City, for instance. So at least in that case, in the 1920s, soccer very much was a way of sort of demonstrating Europeanness and whiteness as opposed to Puerto Ricanness, I guess. But whether that happened in the earlier period, I can't entirely say.
Thank you. I got to run to another meeting.
Thanks, Peter. And as Peter put in the chat, on November 11th, Brian will be a guest with the Football Scholars Forum. So there is a link there, and you can join again. And maybe Brian will have a more evolved answer to that as he goes back.
Got my homework, I guess.
Yeah, that's your homework. Seems we have two more questions. One, I think, is pretty straightforward, and it comes from Chris Bolzman, the co-editor of the other book out this summer, The Soccer Frontiers. Brian has a chapter in there. He was asking about the process of getting a contract at the University of Illinois Press, which is, if there's a pecking order of sporting presses, it's right up there at the top.
Yeah, I mean, I know, and maybe Gabe and Stephen can speak to this too, that the landscape for publishing a work in U.S. soccer history, I'm not sure was very open, maybe even as 10 years ago or something like that. I think it really was, to be perfectly honest, the interest of the editor there. And I had originally been talking about boxing. That was my original plan, was to write a book about boxing, Spanish and Argentine boxers in the 1920s. And then I got sort of sidetracked into soccer. And I guess we had just sort of kept up correspondence, and then we met at the AHA actually in 2020. That was like my last, I think, trip out of town. And yeah, he was just really interested in publishing the book. I think he was interested in expanding the University of Illinois Press's sort of sport footprint, if that makes sense. I know they had just published a book on ice hockey, for instance, and so I think it fit in there. And yeah, I mean, he was just very enthusiastic about the project, and so we went forward with it. It was great, and I think, like I said, I'm not sure it wasn't necessarily me. It was more about his interest in the project.
David.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Brian, I suppose I've said it like in social media. I don't know if I've said it to your face or not, if this counts as face-to-face, but congratulations on just such an amazing achievement. There's so much I'd like to ask and talk about, but I guess one thing that I'd been wanting to ask about you is in some ways a follow-up to Peter's question. On page 187, you say, you talk about failure of growth, and you say, the cause of this failure was not necessarily because soccer was seen as un-American, but rather because it was too closely identified with a single ethnic group, British Protestants. And I'm sure some people on this call would want to undermine or deconstruct or devalue that notion of that being a single ethnic group, or maybe it was for a short period of time, and that precedes the kind of emergence of ethnic identity that Peter seemed to be touching on. But to me, what's one of many things that's so valuable about this book is the way in which it serves as case studies for how different sporting entities have very different objectives, very different missions. So even polemicizing that notion of it being failure, right? The perception that these ethnic groups that put together soccer clubs to represent their interests, as if they had some kind of an obligation to grow the game for the game's own sake, is not something they would have even cared to take on. But I'm wondering too, like trying to connect the dots critically with some of what you're saying, to what degree was, and I think maybe it's like a critical juncture moment there, and maybe that notion of that being a single ethnic group and the values that they upheld and the role that amateurism played in that, at that kind of critical juncture point, maybe especially 1894. And I wondered if you could talk about maybe the resistance to ill-gotten gain, or the fact that maybe your gate receipts would go to the winners being too much like gambling or ill-gotten gain. I just wondered if you wanted to speak to those kind of the ethical values that community would have held, and perhaps the way that was maybe contrary to any missionary sense of growing the game for its own sake.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different periods. I think you're right. In the 19th century, in the 1890s, a lot of the communities, like in Pittsburgh, for instance, there was this emphasis on amateurism and kind of maintaining the purity of the game. And I think in contrast, in particular to, the professionalism of baseball in the United States. And so I think that was an important part of it. I think that was, again, maybe connected back in some way to the prevalence of Scots in the organizing, just because, obviously professionalism was later to come in Scotland. And I think it was a part of the whole package of what football meant. I think that was true around the world. You see similar sorts of things in Brazil and all these other places where these English and Scottish immigrants want to maintain this kind of upper class elite notion of what sport and what especially football is about. And they really, were disturbed by professionalism, I guess. I think by the 1920s, maybe that changes a little bit. I think in the quote that you read was at least mainly more focused so much on the situation in Holyoke in particular, because you did have a pretty large population of Irish immigrants. And so I think the notion of Protestantism versus Catholicism was much more salient in Holyoke in this period than it might have been in some other places, because you did have the Irish. You also had a fair number of Germans and then Portuguese in some of the neighboring communities as well. And so I think that was maybe stronger there than it was in some other parts of the country. Yeah, I mean, I guess a responsibility, I think you're right, that in the 1890s, a lot of these clubs and individuals would have said that the sport should die out if it, lapsed into professionalism, and that they didn't feel any responsibility to maintain a tarnished vision of what they felt was this sort of pure sport. I think in the 1920s, or at least in Holyoke with the Falcos, I mean, it is a professional league, and I think they did, at least the backers did want it to succeed, and they wanted, the sport to grow and thrive. And so I do think that they felt at least some, certainly economic motivation to grow the game and have it succeed. I was also just reading some stuff about Fall River, and how much it meant to them from the perspective of a showcase for the city. That having a successful football team or soccer team was a point of a civic pride, which I think is also a motivation then to kind of grow the game and to show that Fall River was this, kind of the hotbed, or the beating heart of American soccer at the turn of the 20th century. Was not St. Louis, or not, New York, or not Chicago, but it was Fall River. So I hope that answers your question.
I also just want to say that the first paragraph of your concluding chapter, it really is the statement that sums it up so much in terms of the value of soccer history in American studies. It's just worth the price of the entire book alone. That one paragraph is just so beautifully written. So congrats.
Well, thanks. I think I sort of threw I shouldn't say this maybe, but isn't it always the case that the things that you sort of dash off at the last minute are the ones that people find the best? So I should try to do all my writing like that.
Any other questions? I think Kevin Tala, I see Jed's hand again, and then how about we go to Jed, and then we'll finish up with Kevin Talek Marston.
Thanks, Tom. In a sense, it's sort of a couple of points, because obviously my ears pricked up the minute I heard about amateurism and professionalism, which is one of the areas I'm looking at the moment. I'd make a point that, from my opinion on what I'm seeing in the UK in the 1870s and 80s, yes, there's amateurism. Yes, Scotland goes professional in 1893, England in 1885 under very specific circumstances. But of course, the Scotch professor goes to England specifically to be paid from the 1870s. But I mean, no disrespect to anyone that's been to East Lancashire and Darwin, Accrington, Burnley, Blackburn. You're going to go there because you're paid, right? You're not going there to enjoy yourself. In that sense, they were mill towns, and so I'm wondering if that acceptance of being paid actually crossed the Atlantic with a lot of people. People misunderstand, because Queen's Park were amateur and they were the biggest, the most influential team of all time in my book. I think it sometimes gets skewed. And a slightly more modern comment, you're talking about Fall River and it being, part of a PR thing. Well, the same thing happened here 20 years ago when the new town of Livingston, 20 miles to the west of Edinburgh, they basically stole Meadowbank Thistle and set it up again and called it Livingston, because otherwise, how would it get mentioned on the telly or the radio? You can guarantee if you've got a football team, it gets mentioned 5 or 6 times on a Saturday. That's why people like Hartlepool wanted to keep their club and keep it in the league, because it's the only time places like that got any PR.
Yeah, I mean, the question about did it cross the Atlantic? I mean, I'm at least in the 1890s, I don't know, it would have been a really risky thing to cross the Atlantic, assuming you were going to make enough money playing soccer in the United States. I think a lot of Scottish immigrants did come for other kinds of jobs and then were happy to take payments of various sorts to also play football. I'm thinking about a group of brothers, McKendrick brothers, who ended up first in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis and then in Detroit. And then they later played for the Baltimore in the professional leagues in 1894. And so they were clearly, they were stonecutters by trade, but they were clearly open to, being professionals, being paid to play soccer, either overtly as part of those professional leagues in 1894 or through other means. There's sort of hints that they were getting payments. But again, since we rely so much on newspapers, they weren't reporting those sorts of payments, whether they were under the table or over the table. I found in Holyoke, even after the 20th century, that the firms would give jobs to people who also played. Now, whether that was they did that, which came first, I don't know. It's not in the archives. So I think you're right that a lot of Scottish immigrants came over here and then discovered that, hey, we could make money doing this as well, in addition to our day jobs.
Kevin, why don't you finish this up, and then we'll give final comments to Brian before we say goodbye.
Thanks, Tom. Brian, thank you so much for the talk today. Just a quick question, well, two-part question. One, I was curious from a methodological point of view, your sources, etc. What was the most challenging source or problem that you had anything to do from that standpoint? And if there was anything you do differently, I think it's interesting whenever people are working on a project, what would we do differently after you finished a project, if there's anything you want to do differently. And then more from a sort of synthesis macro point of view, we have these two impressive books, one monograph, yours, and then the edited collection that come out in the last couple months. And I'm curious for your thoughts on, what is, if you step back from all of that now, because you've just written this monograph, and we've got the edited collection. What are the big themes, macro themes that you see coming out of those two books?
I guess
Kevin is at the disco right now. He's
Sorry, I hope you could hear that.
Yeah, your first question, I think the biggest challenge is, probably, as you know, is dealing with almost exclusively newspaper sources, and how infuriatingly vague or incomplete or inconsistent or just flat out wrong they can be, and trying to piece together enough information to put together a compelling narrative and even a complete storyline sometimes. Just trying to figure out who won a league or who won a cup in a certain year often took an enormous amount of research. And even then, that answer was not available. I think that was probably the biggest challenge. I think the other thing that I tended to notice was that, I didn't know if there would be archival sources beyond newspapers, but I was struck by just how little information there is. Even when you go and look, like I looked at the Far Alpaca Company records such as they exist, and there's zero mention of the soccer team whatsoever. And I think just that fact, just the almost complete lack of any kind of institutional sources for clubs or competitions is probably the greatest challenge. Peter's not here anymore, but he was, I think was it this summer or last year, he was going to teach a course, and he wanted information about primary sources for US soccer history that he could maybe use in that class. And a couple of us put together a bunch of resources for him. And I thought, well, these are not all that great. There's just not that much, the Spalding guides and some other stuff. And he said, wow, I'm amazed at how much information you guys have for this history. So I guess it's all relative, that compared to Africa, where his research lies, maybe we have a wealth of information, but compared to, say England or other areas, it's just a challenge to find anything outside of newspapers, I guess. Your other question about what I would do differently, I don't know. Maybe I haven't had enough time to reflect on that so much. I mean, I spent a lot of time, my wife will attest that she had to hear constant, discussions in my own mind really out loud about how to organize this and what to include and what to exclude. And, I think at a certain point I arrived at this organization and this setup, and I felt like that was kind of enough. I mean, I probably could have expanded it to include other areas, other topics. But I guess, yeah, I don't know. I haven't had enough time perhaps to reflect on that other larger questions. So.
Why don't we end with the third question that Kevin had in there?
Sorry.
Looking at your monograph and then the collection that George and Chris, just put out. What are some of the, big ticket themes? Some of the things, trends that jump out at you, having seen both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I haven't finished reading the collection yet. I've only read a couple of contributions. I mean, I do think some of the questions that people have brought up here are themes that emerge, and that may be themes for subsequent research, like Peter talking about, the relationship between the sport and developing notions of whiteness. I think, ideas about community identity, I think, are important. I think more work, if possible, on kind of the economic side of it would be a topic, maybe that hasn't really, maybe that's impossible given our sources, but I think that's an area that might be worth looking at. I mean, I'm excited for Ed's, Ed's project about the kind of interconnectedness of these various communities. I've always in the past described US soccer as this sort of patchwork quilt of all these different almost like islands, isolated from one another. And I think Ed's work has shown that they were in fact connected in, much more closely at a much earlier time than maybe we had anticipated before. So I think that's a theme that is going to be really interesting going forward, is just how, our sense of that, like islands separated from each other, is maybe not as accurate, or doesn't tell the whole story in a way that I think a lot of us might have thought. And then, of course, other kinds of research into different groups, can we find more African American players, for instance, or, other, Spanish speaking players, when do those communities really begin to play the game? I think those are other areas. And of course, women's football as well. I mentioned that in the book, that, there could be more detailed studies in some places in California or in the Northeast that might provide a lot more detail than I could get in this book.
That's a great way to go out, as the final whistle, no added time, has been blown. Just want to thank, Brian, once again, just an amazing, contribution to American soccer history, a foundational text. So a virtual round of applause and congratulations for Brian. Please join us in a month. We don't know when, but someone on the committee said this next month, November, will be the 30th anniversary of the Women's World Cup and that, first trophy. So we've Tentatively, we've got the coach from that team, Anson Dorrance, willing to join us. We are tracking down the captain of that team, April Heinrichs, and a journalist or so to complete a 3 or 4 person panel. So stay tuned for that. And once again, thank you. The word community has been thrown around